I remember the exact moment I realized I didn't recognize the man I married anymore. We were sitting across from each other in the kitchen, late at night. The silence stretching so tight between us I could hear the hum of the refrigerator like a roar. I had just told him I was feeling overwhelmed again, that the weight of things lately had become unbearable, and instead of meeting me with concern or even indifference, he let out a laugh. A small, sharp one, like a flick of a knife. "You're just too emotional," he said, shrugging like it explained everything, like that diagnosis excused him from caring. Those words sank into me, not like a wound, but like a stain, something permanent. I had heard them before, not just from him, but from teachers, bosses, even strangers when I got teary during a movie. But hearing them from my husband, the man who once held me like I was made of stars and could collapse, at any moment felt like betrayal blooming in my chest. He said it often after that, sometimes playfully, sometimes as a weapon. "You're too emotional to talk about money. You're too emotional to think clearly. You're too emotional to be a good mother." The worst part wasn't even the words, it was the calm certainty with which he said them, as if my feelings were storms and his were law. I began to shrink in those conversations, even when I was right. I'd try to rein in my tone, steady my voice, but it never mattered. He still accused me of losing control. I began to record our conversations. At first, it was to keep track of what was said during arguments, for my own sanity. Then it became a quiet compulsion. I'd replay them at night, sitting on the bathroom floor with the shower running, listening to the tone of his voice, the phrases he used, the way he'd sigh like he was exhausted by my existence. And slowly, I began to realize something vital. It wasn't me. I wasn't too emotional. I was reacting like any human would to being undermined, gaslit, and diminished. But the tapes didn't just catch the arguments. They caught the monologues, the way he'd talk to himself when he thought I couldn't hear. One night, I found a memo on his phone he must have recorded accidentally. He was in the car, talking aloud like he was venting to someone invisible. "She's losing it. I can't deal with her shit anymore. I could scream sometimes, you know? I'm doing everything, paying the bills, working, and she just cries all the time like a goddamn child." His voice wasn't angry, though. It was amused, like he was describing a sitcom character. He sounded so far away from the man who used to whisper love into my hair. More memos surfaced. Some deliberate, others accidental. One where he admitted to flirting with a coworker and said, "It's not cheating if I don't care about her. And besides, can you blame me? My wife's always either crying or staring into space like a ghost." Another where he mocked my voice, mimicking the way I'd asked him for reassurance after my miscarriage. That one made me vomit. Still, I kept quiet. I waited. The day I told him I wanted a divorce, he called me dramatic. "You're throwing away 10 years because of your feelings," he said, shaking his head like I was a teenager flouncing out of prom. "You're not thinking straight." But I was, clearer than I'd ever been. When we got to court, he wore his best mask, reasonable, composed, a little confused about why we were even there. He said I had a history of emotional instability, that he'd tried to help, but I was unreachable. The judge looked at me carefully, perhaps expecting tears, a breakdown, some outburst that would confirm the narrative. I didn't give them that. I gave them his voice. I handed over the memos, all neatly labeled, cataloged by date, with transcripts. I watched the judge's face shift as they listened through headphones. I watched my husband's smile falter, just slightly, as the courtroom thickened with the weight of his own words. He tried to speak, to clarify, to explain, but his voice was already in the room, clear, unfiltered, cruel. He sat across from me in that cold courtroom, adjusting his tie like this was a job interview, like charm could still rescue him. The same charm he'd used on my friends, my family, even the therapist we saw once before he refused to go again. I watched him shift in his seat, trying to gauge whether the judge was on his side. I recognized that expression. It was the same one he used when he wanted something from me without saying it. The same careful manipulation dressed up as sincerity. The judge looked down at the stack of printed transcripts now in the court's possession. I had highlighted certain moments in yellow. There were timestamps. There were pauses noted. There were parts where his laughter was transcribed in brackets. Laughs. I had worried that the voice alone wouldn't carry the impact I needed. That maybe I was reaching, maybe they wouldn't hear what I had heard. But as I watched the judge's face tighten and relax, wrinkle in surprise, harden in distaste, I knew it was landing. He was listening to the memo where my husband called me a moody liability, where he laughed to himself after mocking the way I had cried after my father's funeral. "It's like she's trying to perform sadness," he had said. Like, "Are you grieving or just desperate for attention?" His voice in that memo had a cruelty so casual, so rehearsed, it made my skin crawl to hear it again. I hadn't cried once in court, not yet. But hearing it played aloud, in front of him, in front of strangers, somehow felt like justice beginning to breathe. He tried to interrupt. His lawyer objected, said the memos were taken out of context, that they were private expressions, not meant to be weaponized. The judge silenced him with a hand and leaned forward, peering at him with something sharper than disapproval. "Is this your voice on the recording?" the judge asked. My husband hesitated. He was used to being able to manipulate conversations. He never had to answer questions directly. But now, under oath, he was cornered. "Yes," he said eventually. "But I was venting. I didn't know." The judge held up a hand again. "You didn't know you'd be held accountable." He shut his mouth. For the first time, I saw panic flicker behind his eyes. It was brief, but real. More memos followed, ones where he cursed about our son, complaining that fatherhood was a leash, saying he missed the days when he could just leave the house without 2 hours of whining and emotional theatrics. Another where he admitted to threatening me, casually, while drunk. "I didn't hit her," he said, slurring, "but I scared her. And that's almost better. Fear gets faster results." I could see the room change around us. The lawyers were quieter now. The judge was no longer just reviewing a separation. He was investigating a pattern, an emotional abuser caught in the very web he wove. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, and watched my husband's composure crumble. One muscle at a time. The thing about being called too emotional is that it starts to work like a spell. You begin to second-guess your instincts, your reactions, your voice. You wonder if you are unbalanced, irrational, unstable. You tell yourself that maybe love means holding it all in. But hearing him, in his own voice, say things I'd always been told I was imagining, that was my exorcism. In one of the memos, he called me a ticking bomb, and then, as if delighted by his own metaphor, said, "If she ever explodes, I'll just point at the mess and say, 'See, told you.'" The judge paused on that one, asked him to explain. He stammered. He said it was just a figure of speech. He said everyone says things they don't mean. The judge didn't nod. He just turned to me, asking quietly if I had anything else to submit. I did. I submitted photos of the aftermath of those figure-of-speech moments, door frames dented from slammed fists, bruises on my upper arm shaped like fingers. I hadn't included them before. I was afraid they wouldn't be believed unless paired with the evidence of his own voice admitting he liked the feeling of control. "Sometimes," he had said, "it feels good to know she's scared. At least then I know she's listening." When I played that one, my lawyer placed her hand gently on mine. I hadn't cried still, but I was shaking. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. Recognition. The judge leaned back slowly, taking a breath like a man who had just tasted something sour. The room was silent for a long moment. My husband, no, my ex-husband-to-be, finally stopped fidgeting. I think even he realized then that no amount of deflection would bury what had already been unearthed. He looked at me then, and for the first time in years, he looked afraid. After the judge called for a short recess, the courtroom emptied slowly, hushed, like people were walking through a graveyard of something they hadn't meant to witness. I sat alone on the wooden bench outside, my hands clasped together, not praying, not trembling, just still. The quiet around me wasn't peace, but it was something near it. A reprieve. The kind of silence you get after screaming into a storm until it finally breaks and the rain starts to fall. Clean, steady, unrelenting. He walked past me then, flanked by his lawyer, who whispered something urgent into his ear. He didn't look at me. That surprised me. He always looked at me. Even when we were fighting, even when I was sobbing in the kitchen and he was yelling about dinner or bills or whatever had set him off that day, he would always make sure I saw him. He liked being the center of my gaze, my gravity, but not now. Now his eyes were fixed ahead like a guilty child waiting to be scolded. I thought I would feel triumphant in that moment, but I didn't. I felt hollow, like I had cracked open and let everything drain out just to survive. I had carried those voice memos in my phone for 2 years. I had listened to them more times than I'd ever admit, sometimes in anger, sometimes in disbelief, sometimes just to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't invented the way he treated me, that the pain wasn't imaginary. What most people never understand about emotional abuse is how quiet it can be. There's no yelling at first, no violence, just a soft erosion. It's subtle, a look of disappointment when you laugh too loud, a sigh when you talk about your day, a joke that hurts but somehow makes you feel like the one who's wrong for not laughing. And then comes the guilt. Not his, yours. Always yours. You become your own warden, silencing yourself before he ever needs to. When we returned to court, the judge's demeanor had shifted. He was colder now, more direct, less patient with my husband's lawyer's evasions and protests. He asked pointed questions. Do you consider it appropriate to call your wife a ticking bomb? Do you think mocking her grief is normal marital behavior? Were you aware that recording oneself admitting emotional manipulation can be used as evidence of intent? My husband, no, let's stop calling him that. Eli finally tried to push back. This is a hit job, he said. She's cherry-picked moments and framed them to make me look like a monster. The judge didn't flinch. No one framed you, Mr. Ryland. You framed yourself. His lawyer began to sweat visibly. I could see it from my seat. He whispered again, this time more urgently. But Eli wasn't used to being silenced, not by anyone. So he kept talking, trying to reason his way through, trying to reclaim the image he had curated for so long. The charismatic husband, the stable one, the logical one. I was under pressure, he said. We had a kid, a mortgage, my job was— Did your wife work? The judge interrupted. Yes, but not— Did she also care for the child? Yes. Did she do the cooking? Sometimes, but— Did she do the emotional labor of the household? Holidays, school events, family coordination? There was a pause. I guess. You guess? Eli swallowed hard. Yes. Then came the part that changed everything. The judge leaned forward and said, Do you think your wife's emotions were the problem, or your reaction to them? And Eli for once had nothing to say. I closed my eyes. Not in triumph, but in release. Because that was it, wasn't it? That was the truth he could never admit. I wasn't too emotional. He was too terrified of emotions he couldn't control. And when my grief or sadness or even joy didn't fit his template, he called it instability. When I cried, he saw it as weakness. When I raised my voice, he called it hysteria. But the truth was, he couldn't stand a woman who wouldn't flatten herself to make room for his ego. When custody was discussed, I was prepared for the worst. I had heard horror stories. But the judge had already heard the voice memo where Eli said, "I love my son, but I didn't sign up to be a babysitter." The memo where he said, "I'll take custody if it means screwing her over." I didn't even have to speak. The words had already spoken for me. The judge ordered a psychological evaluation for him, full custody to me, with supervised visitation, for 6 months, subject to review. The ruling was clinical, restrained, but the relief that washed over me was seismic. It felt like blood returning to frozen limbs. I wanted to cry, but not because I was broken. Because I was healing. Afterward, as we left the courtroom, Eli approached me in the hallway. I braced myself, unsure of what he'd say. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He just stared at me for a moment before speaking in a voice low and rough. "You really hate me that much?" he asked. I looked him straight in the eyes, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel fear or doubt, only clarity. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I'll never let you rewrite who I was again." He nodded, and there was something almost childlike in his face then, something lost. And maybe that's what he had always been, a boy who grew up confusing control for love, power for respect. He walked away. I never saw him the same way again. After the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied for good, I walked out into a sunlit afternoon that felt completely foreign to me. It was strange, how the world outside continued to move as if mine hadn't just been unstitched and re-sewn entirely. The breeze rustled the trees like any other Tuesday. Cars passed on the street. Strangers laughed. A busker played guitar near the courthouse steps. Life had not paused to acknowledge what had just occurred. But for me, it was a rebirth. I didn't go home right away. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel as the silence grew thick around me again. But this time, it didn't suffocate. It soothed. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone, broken or hardened, but I just looked free. That night, I tucked my son into bed with more gentleness than I'd had in me for years. He was only 5, too young to understand everything, but old enough to sense that something had shifted. He didn't ask where his dad was. He just looked at me longer than usual, as if studying my face. His small fingers brushed mine as he said, "You're not sad tonight." "No," I whispered, "not tonight." He smiled and rolled over, pulling his stuffed bear against his chest. Later, alone, I opened my laptop and deleted the folder that had held every single one of the voice memos. They had done their job. They had given me proof, power, vindication. But I didn't need to carry them anymore. I didn't need to relive every word to remind myself I had been right. It was over. I had escaped the echo chamber of a marriage built on silence and control and false narratives. I had reclaimed the truth, but healing isn't linear, and peace isn't instant. There were nights that followed where I woke up in a sweat, convinced I'd imagined it all, that the court hadn't believed me, that the judge had sided with him. I'd rush to the living room, check my phone, reread the official documents just to breathe. I was still deprogramming the idea that I was the problem, still unlearning the internal chorus of doubt he had seeded in me. The worst part was the aftermath from others. People I thought were friends sent neutral texts. "I hope you two can find peace." As if peace could be brokered between abuser and survivor. His mother emailed me asking if I'd consider being fair about visitations. His cousin called and said, "But he was always so nice to us. Maybe you just weren't compatible." I didn't answer them, because here's what no one tells you about emotional abuse. It's invisible to everyone except the person being carved from the inside out. And even then, you question it. For years, I walked on the eggshells he claimed I threw on the floor. I smiled in family photos after nights spent crying behind the bathroom door. I let him script my emotions and gaslight my reactions until I was only ever apologizing or staying quiet. Now I was neither. The weeks passed. My son asked about Eli less and less. When we moved into the smaller house on the edge of town, a cozy 2-bedroom with lavender bushes along the walkway, he danced across the hardwood floors, calling it our new fort. I painted his room the color of the sky and let him help choose the curtains. He picked dinosaurs. I picked a quiet shade of peace for my own room, sea glass green, like the ocean I used to dream of when I wanted to disappear. Eli texted once. Just once. It was a simple message. I didn't realize how far it had gone. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. There was no apology big enough, no confession deep enough to reverse the damage, and more importantly, I no longer needed one. His remorse, if that's what it was, had nothing to offer me. I began therapy, not for the divorce, but for the years I spent slowly dissolving. I told my therapist how I used to time my emotions, rehearse my words, smile through pain because anything else made me irrational. How I apologized before speaking. How I flinched when I dropped a glass, not because of the noise, but because of the reaction I expected from the man who used to live in my home. She looked at me gently and said, "That wasn't a relationship. That was survival." And I wept. Then, for hours. For the woman I had been. For the girl who thought being loved meant being small. For every time I bit my tongue until it bled just to keep the peace. But the tears weren't weakness anymore. They were proof. Of recovery. Of resilience. Of having found my way back to myself. Months later, I stood on a pier with my son, watching the water churn beneath our feet. He held my hand as we tossed pebbles into the bay, each one vanishing with a soft plop. He giggled at the splash. I watched the ripples spread outward and thought about how healing looks like this. Small changes, widening circles. He looked up at me and said, "You're happy now." And I was. Not always. Not every day. But enough. Enough to know that I had walked through fire, and instead of burning, I emerged whole. People still use that phrase sometimes. Too emotional. They say it on TV. I see it online. I hear it in offhanded comments at work, at the grocery store. I don't flinch anymore, because I know better now. Emotions didn't ruin my marriage. Suppressing them did. Denying them. Being punished for having them. And when I stopped accepting that narrative, when I finally let the truth speak, through my voice, through his, I was no longer just emotional. I was powerful. And no one gets to diminish that again.